And here we are, episode number 2.
So, and I have a name for the podcast now.
Oh, snap.
Episode 2, The Road to Code.
Oh, that's the name of the podcast? The Road to Code. I like it. What are all the platforms that we're going to be posting our podcast?
Yeah, so you can find us on YouTube, on SoundCloud, and hopefully we'll find something else to stream this podcast on, but those are the 2 so far.
All right, so I'll put my notes down here, YouTube, SoundCloud. What was the other one?
I was looking at another one. I think it's called, oh shoot, I forget the name. But there's another podcasting website for like just podcasts.
Okay. There's another one. We'll put that in the show notes. So let's do an overview. Episode 1, we talked about who we are. So we're not going to cover that again. If you guys, anybody wants to know more about Jonathan and I, you guys can go and listen to episode number 1. And then we also gave a 10,000 foot level of the next 12 weeks about this podcast. And so one of the things that we discussed was that we're going to be reading a book. This will kind of guide us, or will guide you and guide me for the topics of the podcast, but more importantly, guide you while you're learning C#. And so we actually bought the book on Amazon, and the name of the book, I'm going to share my screen really quick for anybody who is interested. Let's see. I'll share my Kindle. So the name of the book is called C#8 and .NET Core 3.0 Modern Cross-Platform Development. And it says it's building applications with C#, .NET Core, Entity Framework Core, ASP.NET Core, and ML.NET using Visual Studio Code. So the book is a great guide, but we're actually going to add some more to it. We're going to be using Visual Studio 2019, which is the latest version of Visual Studio. You're already using Visual Studio Code, right?
Yeah, that was pretty cool. Like seeing the process of downloading it again through the book, instead of having just a video of just you saying, click this. But yeah, the Visual Studio Code, I've been using it for a little bit now. So yeah, pretty comfortable with it.
Very nice, very nice. The author is Mark J. Price. We're giving him a free plugin. This is the book that we've decided to use, and Mark J. Price just happened to have the latest edition of C#8 and .NET Core. To be fair, and to let other publishers catch up, .NET 5.0 was released in November. And so November 2020. So it's only been a couple of months. People are probably still writing books. There's no reason to say that Mark J. Price wouldn't be coming out with the latest version. He has a couple of editions on this same one. In fact, this is the 4th edition. And he's done a really good job of keeping everything up to date. There was this, and there was another book, but they're kind of neck and neck. The other book was a little bit more advanced, and so I felt that was going to be a little bit overwhelming for you. But yeah, this is the book that we're reading. So if you want to purchase it over at Amazon, you are more than welcome to, and follow along with this podcast. In this episode 2, we just finished reading chapter 1. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. So yeah, so there's that. What I want to do, Jonathan, is, since the book uses Visual Studio Code for some of its examples, I think it would be a good thing for you to start getting used to programming in true cross-platform. So it's kind of unfair for me to tell you, hey, you can be like a fish and breathe underwater when I've never showed you that you can breathe underwater, you know? So coding cross-platform is kind of the same. I can't tell you like, hey, all your code's going to run on Mac and Linux if you don't code for Mac and Linux. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have you share your screen. All right. So why don't you go ahead and start by downloading VirtualBox. If you just go to Google and search for VirtualBox, one word, and then download as a second word. Yep, there you go. So VirtualBox is a product that Oracle made, and it's a free open source, I believe, uh, virtual host that allows you to run several operating systems. So you're going to download. Actually, you can go to the top. The top should be by downloading. You agree. Let's see here. If you're looking at VirtualBox 6 packages, so oh, there you go. So where it says Windows host.
Yeah.
So your box is a Windows machine, so you'll be downloading that one. And then once it finishes download, go ahead and launch it. And then while that's happening, we'll start talking about the book, chapter 1.
Chapter 1.
So the book starts talking about well, actually, you know what? I read like from page 1. I don't know if you did.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, yeah. So they start talking about the visual code GitHub roadmap, where they have a lot of good stuff on GitHub about Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code happens to be open source. Do you know what open source is?
Yeah, it's just free to use kind of thing. You don't have to pay for it. It's everyone could use it kind of thing.
You're right. It's a little bit more than that as well. Essentially, once you feel comfortable enough to contribute to this free product, you can actually contribute changes to it. So open source means that the source is freely available for you to view, but you can also participate in the development. So you can actually create a feature for Visual Studio and submit it to the Visual Studio code team. And if they accept your change, then you become, a contributor to Visual Studio Code.
Cool.
So that's what open source means. Yeah, so there's like in the book, it explains it gives you the roadmap page. All right, it looks like you got a VirtualBox all set.
Yeah.
What's the next thing on the list that we need to do with that? You installed it. Let's go ahead and download a torrent client. So go back to Chrome and look for BitTorrent, all one word. There you go. Download. Yeah, that one. And we're not going to download anything illegal while we're doing the podcast. Of course not. We're going to actually download Ubuntu, and Ubuntu allows you to download via BitTorrent and in the most legal fashion you can imagine. They actually encourage it because if you download directly from their website, their ISO image takes about an hour to download, where if you do it via BitTorrent, it actually downloads really quick. So one of the things that they talked about in there was a comparison article where they're comparing Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio. Did you happen to see that article where, is Visual Studio Code stepping on the toes of Visual Studio?
Oh yeah. No, they're not, because they are two different things. It's
Exactly.
Visual Studio Code. I had it in my notes on Drive real quick. Let me open that.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Visual Studio Code is for cross-platform development, and then videos 2019 was just for Windows development.
That's partly true, yeah. So Visual Studio Code is cross-platform, 100%. Visual Studio also allows you to do cross-platform. But if you're going to be doing certain features, like if you're going to be doing Windows Universal apps, you cannot use Visual Studio Code. You have to use Visual Studio.
Mhm.
If you're going to be coding for Windows applications, you have to do it with Visual Studio. You can't do it with Visual Studio Code. If you're going to be coding for ASP.NET web forms, you have to do it with Visual Studio. Visual Studio Code doesn't have the plugins to do it. There might be plugins, but because all those developments started with Visual Studio, you would need, and I think you need a couple of, in order to be able to program for a few other types of applications that strictly run on Windows, you would need Visual Studio. But Visual Studio does allow you to do cross-platform. You can develop for Linux, Mac, and Windows, and you can also develop for iOS. And in order to develop for iOS, you're going to need Xcode, so you're going to need a Mac essentially.
Mhm.
But you could do it with Visual Studio in that sense. You can still do it with Visual Studio Code, and there's some minor differences. I personally have been working mostly with Visual Studio, so I feel very comfortable with Visual Studio. But Visual Studio Code simplifies the development process drastically, and so we'll go through some of those differences. All right, so let's go and find the Ubuntu download. Oh, CR alternative downloads. There you go. And then so you wanna download the LTS. Do you know what LTS stands for?
No.
It's LTS stands for long-term support.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So remember they talked about the book as well. So .NET also has an LTS version. This is something that's very common in the industry for software. So you want to download, let me see, which one are we doing? We're going to download version 2010 and 64-bit edition. Yep, hit OK.
There we go.
There it is. So that'll download pretty quickly while we're talking. So yeah, so LTS is long-term support, and a lot of software is using it, including .NET. So they have there's a difference between a release and an LTS. So a release, right now we're in version 5 of .NET, and it's the release version. It's 5.0. They put it out to the public, they'll get some feedback. And then once they get that feedback, they'll improve, polish off the rough edges, and then they'll release the LTS. And that's the one that they'll support for several years. They'll patch it, they'll fill in the security gaps, all that good stuff. The release, they'll stop patching that at one point. They'll stop, they won't support it anymore. So you'll want to move from the release to the LTS as soon as you can, once the LTS is out in the wild. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, they had, as I was reading the chapter, they had quite a few articles that he was referencing to, and the big one was the roadmap for Visual Studio. And so unfortunately, I didn't see anything for 2021. I was kind of bummed. I was like, man, I hope it's not going to go away. But I don't think it's going to go away. There's a lot of stuff that still is being supported for Windows. And Visual Studio really does a lot of things that Visual Studio Code doesn't do. And so there wasn't anything that said it was going to go away. But, we're I'm kind of hopeful. An interesting fact that I found was that Visual Studio, I mentioned this before, it's only available for Mac and Windows and not Linux. Now, the prediction that I found was because Java is a prominent programming language on Linux, there's probably going to be a Visual Studio for Linux at some point because they want to compete against Java. And that's really the whole purpose why C# was created, to compete against Java. We talked in the last episode about that legal battle that they had that ended up bankrupting Sun Microsystems. And so they definitely want to compete against Java. Java's prominent in the Linux platform. So there's going to be a Visual Studio, I believe. And so, we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully that's going to be available sometime soon. But Visual Studio Code is available for Linux. And so that's the whole purpose of having you set up this virtual environment so that you can also code on Linux and get that feel for working with Git on Windows and working with Git on Linux. And you're going to find that the commands that you're currently working on with Git on Windows is going to be the same exact command on Linux. And you're also going to find Visual Studio Code is very much identical to the way it operates on Windows. And so it'll be an interesting feel for you to go through, download your repository, develop and run your application on Linux. There's a couple of quirks that you'll need to get used to, but you'll see it's kind of cool to be able to say like, hey, I've developed on Windows and I've actually developed on Linux, and and you get that experience. And I think that's an important thing, with Linux being such a strong contender as an operating system that's out there. They also talked about the Visual Studio Code adoption, who's using it, right? Did you get a chance to see that particular article?
Oh no, I didn't see that article.
There was an article. There
I
was a
didn't get
link.
to take a look at that one.
Yeah, there was a link to an article that he posted on the book that talks about how the Google employees are using Visual Studio Code, and so that
Oh,
seems kind of cool. Like Google's using Visual Studio Code for some of their development.
mhm.
The nice thing about Visual Studio Code is that even though it was created by Microsoft, and you can develop C# and you can develop, all these web applications within Visual Studio Code, it also has plugins so that you can develop Python, Ruby. I mean, it's just become a very flexible and very dominant IDE for developing in different programming languages. And so, Google's using it. They're probably using it for the Golang. I think that there's a plugin for Visual Studio Code so you can program in Go, which is the language that Google created for some of their REST API components that they're creating. And so that was kind of interesting when I read that. What else did he talk about? God, let's get past some of this boring stuff here. He talked about the latest release of Visual Studio Code, which was August 2019. I think they release, what is it, twice a year? Do you remember?
Yeah, it looked like twice a year or
Yeah, I think it's like twice a year that they release. Keyboard shortcuts. Oh man, I think that's like one of the big things about being a very efficient developer, period. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You could be working in Excel, Word, within your browser. Moving your hand away from the keyboard to go find where your mouse is and then right click or click, whatever, it's time consuming.
yeah, I noticed that too. In Visual Studio Code when I use it, it's just easier just to learn all or just have the keyboard shortcuts open up like on another tab somewhere, so it's faster.
Yeah. It's just being on a keyboard is so much faster. So yeah, so they have printouts that you can download. I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. You know, you can just paste it up on your wall and stuff, so that you can be looking up. It's like, how do I do that? You know, as you use them more and
Or
more.
just
Go ahead.
when you're going, just have them next to your wall so you can see them every time you wake up.
Eventually, you just memorize them. But yeah, as you use them more and more, you just memorize them. You know, and so I do that all the time. So yeah. They talked about the mono project as well. Were you able to understand what they were saying about the mono project?
Not really.
All right.
That one was
okay.
Downloading.
Let's talk about mono project. Let's go ahead and shut down. Excuse me. Shut down. So if you go to all downloads inside Q, yeah, right click on that, and you can go ahead and just delete it. We should go to the downloads and we should see an Ubuntu ISO. Oh, there it is. Oh no, that's, oh yeah. See the last one?
Oh, the last one.
Yeah, that's an ISO. That's a disk image, right? So if you were to take an actual CD and convert that to a file, you end up with an ISO image.
Ooh.
So this is essentially, it's actually a DVD image. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to Virtualbox. And let's go ahead and add. So click on the little plus sign. It might be, actually, no, sorry, cancel this. Let's create a new one. New. And let's call it, I don't know, Ubuntu Dev. And so the location where it's at, that's fine. You can go ahead and leave it there. That'll work. And it's a Linux operating system, and it's Ubuntu 64-bit. So we'll go ahead and click on next. And so let's check to see how much memory you have on your machine. So go back to your file browser, right click on that.
Oh.
And go to properties. And so here it'll tell you installed memory. So you got 16 gigs. That's perfect. What we're going to do is we're going to give the virtual machine 6 gigs of RAM. Okay, that'll give it some good performance. Okay, now the other thing I want to see is how many cores are you operating with. So if you go down to a blank area on your start bar and right click and go to Task Manager, and then go over to Performance tab, and then right click where the graph is at, right click on that graph and change the graph to logical processors. Ooh, look at that. You have 8 cores on this machine, and each core is hyper-threaded. So you end up with 16 cores. It's almost like you're running 16 processors. That's pretty impressive. That is a really, really good machine. AMD Ryzen 7. Wow. All right, cool. So I'm thinking we're gonna give this virtual machine some pretty good power. Let's give it 6 cores and 6 gigs of RAM.
Okay.
All right, so let's go back to VirtualBox. And so now you see how the megabyte starts at 1024?
Yeah.
So 1024 is a magic number in computers. 1024 happens to be 1 megabyte. All right, you see how it says megabytes on the side there?
Yeah.
Over on the right side of 1024, it says megabytes. So this is 1 megabyte. So we want to give it a total of 6 megabytes. So that means that we have to multiply 1024 times 6, because you can't just say 6,000 megabytes. There's a particular stepping in the number sequence that you have to go. So if you open up your calculator, you could do window R, there you go, and then do 1024 times 6. So that's how much memory you're going to give it, 6144.
Okay.
And that'll be 6 megabytes. All right, hit next. And then we want to go ahead and create a hard drive. So this is going to be a virtual hard drive that we're going to create. Go ahead. And it'll be a VirtualBox disk image, so that's fine. And we're going to dynamically allocate it. So this is going to, what's going to happen is that as it needs the disk space, it'll create the disk for it. It'll start carving out that size on your hard drive. So go ahead and click next. And this is only 10 megabytes. So what we want to do is we want to give it a hard drive. You don't need that big of a hard drive, but you also need to give it enough for it to be able to perform. We could probably get away with 80 gigs, but I would say go ahead and where it says 10 gigabytes, go ahead and type in, I would say, let's go ahead and give it 120. And like I said, you could probably get away with less. I don't know how much you'll actually be needing, but actually, you know what? We could get away with 80. This 80 should be more than enough. Because this is all you're doing. All right. And so now what we want to do is we want to start this machine. So now what it says, okay, hey, you know what? There's nothing on this operating system. It's if essentially what you got is a machine with no operating system. So it recognizes that and it says, hey, you know, you have a CD drive. It's a virtual CD drive. Would you like to put a virtual disk in there, which is the ISO that we downloaded? So let's go and click on that little folder. And let's go to your, go ahead and hit add. And let's go to your downloads and plug in that ISO image. Yep, and hit choose. And go ahead and start. So now it's going to boot off of that CD drive. All right. And so go ahead. Yeah. Now we can go ahead and just press enter. It's actually checking the disk right now to make sure that it's a valid disk that isn't going to mess up anything. If this had been real hardware, this would be important. It's virtual, not that important. No errors are found. It's all good.
This is cool. I've never created my own machine before.
Oh, really? I actually run a virtual appliance here at my house. So, oh, look at that.
There we go.
Now, okay, so now what we want to do is we want to go ahead. You know what we forgot to do? We forgot to change. Oh, wait, did we give it the 6 cores? We didn't give it the 6 cores, huh?
Yeah.
It's running on 1 core right now. Okay, so let's do this. Go up to where it says machine up on the upper left. ASPI shutdown, I guess. Just do the shutdown. Okay. So what we're going to do is go ahead and hit the X over on the upper right hand. Yep. Go ahead and click that X. And power off the machine. All right. So let's go to the settings. So if you had more than one machine, you have to highlight that machine before you select those buttons. But because you only have one machine, those buttons are targeted to that one machine that you have. So let's go over to system and processor. And in here, give it 6. There you go. And then let's go back to the motherboard. Okay, yes, we have the right amount of memory. Okay, hit okay. Oh, go back to those settings, sorry. Okay, it's network address translation. That's fine, that works perfectly fine.
For example.
So yeah, so basically it's just going to be like if your machine is a router to virtual machine, and that's fine. It works out. Okay, hit okay. And let's go ahead and fire it back up. Let's go back to devices. We need to install go to device, optical drives, and then choose. Oh yeah, you can just click on that right there. Yep.
Cool.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead and capture. So go over to the machine menu and do a reset. And go ahead and reset. All right, press enter. We'll let it go through the test again, and then we'll install it after this. See how it's going a lot quicker now?
Yeah.
It wasn't going this quick before. Go ahead and click on install Ubuntu. And then go ahead and click on continue. This is all English and US. And let's see, let's go ahead and install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi. And we'll do the normal installation. Go ahead and continue. Yeah, we're going to erase the disk and install Ubuntu. So install now. And continue. And continue. We're in Los Angeles, so
It knows where we are.
it knows where you're at. And then go ahead and put your name, Jonathan. And that name of that VirtualBox is perfectly fine. And then you can use a simple password. Go ahead and put your password in there.
Spell my name right.
Let's type your name right, for goodness sakes.
Simple password.
And then you can log in automatically. You don't need to have it require you to log in every time. So we'll let this install. All right. So let's talk about Mono while this is installing. Mono is a project that was created. Let's see here. Miguel de Icaza. And so what Miguel did, Microsoft wanted to make the spec of .NET an open spec. So they submitted it to the European Engineering Standard, ECMA. It's essentially, it's European Consortium of something standards, but it's an ECMA standard that they released. And so Miguel, what he did is he took that spec, right? Imagine somebody giving you a blueprint to build a house. Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh, wow, I can take this blueprint and build my house from it, And Microsoft did that with the .NET framework. And so he took that spec and he created the Mono project. Because when .NET first came out, it only ran on Windows. The whole purpose of creating this .NET platform was for it to be cross-platform. But they had to start somewhere, right? Version 1.0, like let's just make it for Windows. And so that's essentially what they did. And so Miguel de Icaza, what he did is he took the open spec and he's like, let me create it for Windows, or for Linux, I mean. And that's exactly what he did. He created the .NET framework to run on Windows, and he called it the Mono project. So Microsoft gave him access to the developers of the .NET framework. And so he was getting a lot of information. And so he ended up creating the compiler and creating all these things for .NET to run on Linux. And he just kept on, getting closer and closer. There's a lot of things that he didn't have time to do. It was open source, so anybody was able to contribute. And so he did it on his free time. But eventually what he did is he found a niche and he says, wait a second, I can use Mono for Android development. And eventually he used Mono for iOS development. And so Microsoft saw it as like, hey, that's really cool. We want that. And they took everything that Miguel had done, and they bought the Mono project from Miguel. And so they brought it in. And that's where the Visual Studio, okay, so what Miguel did was he created a kind of like a Visual Studio like IDE software so that you can develop, but he called it Xamarin. And so essentially, if you look at the book, it talks about how the Mono project became Visual Studio Code. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think I remember that.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at the Mono project right now. Originally, it was supported by Novell, Xamarin, and now Microsoft. And so they ended up taking Xamarin Studio and turned it into Visual Studio Code. I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, that's what I read. The one thing that I found really cool about .NET is that now not only can you program for Android, iOS, Windows, Mac, Linux, but you can also download what they call the Unity project. And with the Unity project, you can now program for Xbox gaming and PS4. Now, PS4 requires a little bit more in order for it to be able to run. But the fact that now .NET runs on Linux, which is what PS4 runs on. PS4 runs on Linux. So with .NET running on Linux, now you can program for PS4 gaming, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
I've never done any of that, and I don't have any plans for gaming. I'm not a gamer, and that's not really anything that I do. But I just thought, I was like, wow, that is kind of cool. He also provided links to some of the Microsoft blogs. Their blogs just are filled with information. Excuse me. In fact, if you follow their blogs, you get previews into things that haven't even been released to the public yet. And so that's another great way to be able to get ahead of everybody. But again, it's time consuming. And if you have the time, then that's the place to be. So then they talked about the current versus the long-term support, or the LTS. And so the current release is when they first release it. Another interesting change. So when .NET Framework came out in 2002, they called it the .NET Framework. That was the full name, okay? When they created .NET to be cross-platform, they called it .NET Core. Now, they've actually stripped all those names out, and they've only left it with .NET. So it's .NET 5.0. That's the name of the platform. There is no more core, there's no more framework. It's just now .NET, and that's it. Just by itself. Not that anybody learning should care about that, but I think for anybody that comes from like the old school .NET framework, that's some of the things that they need to be aware of. So anybody learning, they're just going to call it .NET. And anybody that has been programming in .NET framework, it's just called .NET these days. It's nothing. What I found interesting, I'm going to skip over the ASP.NET web form and communication. All that stuff is obsolete. It no longer works with .NET Core. Those were very Windows-specific types of projects. So we're going to go cross-platform 100% with this stuff. But what I found interesting is that there is a concept of .NET Standard, okay? And .NET Standard, the way he described it was really interesting. It's not that you install .NET Standard versus .NET. It's like he compared it to trying to install HTML5. You don't install HTML5. All you simply do is you program to the HTML5 standard. Okay. So what does that mean for .NET? It means that if you're going to write code that needs to run on .NET Framework, which only runs on Windows, .NET Core, and .NET, you're going to have to program to the .NET standard, which means that you'll have to leave out certain features that are available only for .NET Framework, only for .NET Core, and only for .NET. And so that kind of narrows your scope, right? Because what's happening is that you have the joining of all these technologies. And if you try to do the .NET standard programmability, you're limited to a very narrow scope of features. At least that's the way I understood it.
Mhm.
Let's go ahead and restart that machine. So that's .NET standard. So I normally stay away from .NET standard because I want to be able to just program to the full capability of .NET 5.0. So anything that I create, whether it's going to be a console application, a web API application, or I'm going to create a library, I'm always going to create a .NET library. You know, none of the .NET standard, none of the .NET anything. I think they're still calling it, they're still including the name core in there. And that's really where you want to go. You want to go to core, you know, and that's, you want to program to that in order to take advantage of all the features of the cross-platform capability without having to tie yourself to any of the legacy stuff, any of the baggage that comes with it. They also, he also talked about Roslyn. So Roslyn is a name, it's a code name. They've always had code names as they're developing. And so Roslyn just happened to be the code name for a particular version of the .NET framework that had been released. And they've kept the name Roslyn. I don't know why they chose the name Roslyn. But essentially it involves the core CLR, the common language runtime. Remember we talked about the runtime in the last episode?
Yeah.
Roslyn also includes the intermediate language. Remember we also talked about the intermediate language where your C# code compiles down to an intermediate language so that it can run, so that when it gets compiled down to the architecture level of your processor, it's actually running as machine language and not interpreted in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And then Roslyn also includes JIT, or just-in-time compiler. And so what happens is that the JIT compiler, or just-in-time compiler, once you finish with your C# code and you compile it, it compiles it down to IL. And then when you run it, the JIT compiler compiles it down to the architecture of your processor. So that's, at that point, it runs it in native machine code. And so that's what the JIT compiler is. And that's also included in Roslyn. Roslyn also contains the base class libraries. In other words, they're just not giving you this raw language called C#. They're actually giving you a ton of functionality in there. The functionality that comes with it, it's like batteries included, like, you know, what they say with Python, right? Python says, oh yeah, batteries are included. This is the same concept. They give you, their base class libraries give you the capability of opening up files so that you don't have to deal with handles and, you know, deal with all this, like, you know, code in order to open up a file. The base class libraries come with capability of opening up libraries, of opening up database connections, of opening up, you know, communication channels and stuff like that. So the base class libraries are very, very rich. So there's a question that I get asked every time I interview. That's just, how do you rate yourself with your experience with C# and .NET? And it said 1 being I'm not experienced at all, and 10 I'm very experienced, right? And so I turn around and I was like, what do you mean by .NET and C#? You know, because if they expect me to know like what the common language runtime does, is like, yeah, sure, I know what that does. If they expect me to understand intermediate language, is like, well, no, I've never read any intermediate language. I've only worked with C#. So that's a ding, right? It's like that takes me from a 10 to a 9. And if they say, if they're talking about the JIT compiler, it's like, I have no idea what the JIT compiler does. All I know that it takes the IL and it converts it to machine language. I've never worked with it any further than that. In fact, I've never even touched it. It just automatically happens for me. So that's another ding on me, right? That brings me down to an 8 when it comes down to how knowledgeable are you? And then they talk about Roslyn BCL. A BCL, there's like so many things that that thing can do. You can do gaming, you can do communications, through socket layers. I mean, you can do port communication, you could do file manipulation. I mean, there's so many things that you could do with the BCL. I've mostly worked with it for web development in my last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years. Prior to that, I've done some Windows development, which is completely different now. In fact, it's almost non-existent. And, and then some services. But if you take like the BCL, I probably, if I was to tell you how much I know of the BCL by memory, I would say maybe 10%. How many points do you take off of my scale from 1 to 10? You know what I mean? So it's such a broad question, and it's a bad question, to ask. It's like, from a scale from 1 to 10, how experienced are you? Because if you say I'm a 10, and they start asking you about some of these like specific things about Roslyn, you're gonna say like, yeah, I don't know. And it's like, well, I thought you were a 10, which meant that you should know everything. It's like, no, you can never know everything. You can know the capabilities, and then you research. You're like, oh yeah, I know it's capable of doing that. Let me see how I can get it to get done, And so you do some research, you grab some code examples, and somebody who's an expert in that particular domain of programming can show you some code, and then you just run with it from there. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, BCL is just, it's a huge library, and there's so many things to it, and so to learn all of BCL, there's just no way. Just no one is capable of it. I don't even think the people who are programming it know the whole BCL, because you have several developers that are developing, and one developer is not going to know what the other developer is doing. Does it make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the last one of Rosalind is CTS, which is the common type system. So this common type system includes some basic types, right? Like your integers, your floats, your decimals, your characters, your string of characters, your Boolean values, your date values. Oh gosh, what else? Enumeration types, interface types. I mean, there's like a whole slew of stuff, right? In this common types. And so as you create a variable and you say an integer I is equal to 1, right? The I happens to be part of the common type system. You're using the common type system. And so you get like this like base level of types that you can begin using within your programming, so that you don't have to go program an integer. You don't have to go program a character. You don't have to go program any of that. That just kind of comes with the language itself and the framework. And so that's what the common type system. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. Where's this machine at? Go ahead and press enter.
Oh.
Ooh, look at that. Do you have an Ubuntu account? You probably don't, huh?
No.
So let's go ahead and, you don't have to do it on the shared screen, but go ahead and open up your browser on one of the other screen, and go to Ubuntu and create an account. While you're doing that, I'll talk about the .NET Native. So the .NET Native, essentially, if you just write your C# code, you compile it into IL, And then when you run it, the JIT compiler converts it to machine language. Well, there's a way to go directly from C# to machine language with the .NET Native. The problem is that you need to know where you're compiling it to. And so there's a whole lot of information that he provided, well, there's an article with the documentation, in order for you to be able to compile to that level. Now, I was trying to figure out what is a good use case. And so to me, if I'm going to be releasing software for like AMD Ryzen, then maybe, you know, that would be the ideal thing to do so that people don't have to run through the compilation process. You get the best performance out of it because you're not compiling it at that point. But it is an inconvenient step. And to some degree, you know, you're targeting a specific platform. And so this is something that I think has a very narrow use case in order to be able to do that. So yeah, I don't see myself doing that. Anybody learning, I don't see anybody while they're learning having to target a specific processor. It already happens automatically when you run it. So this is a very specific use case, but that's what the .NET Native is all about. Another thing that was interesting while I was reading was comparing technologies where the .NET version 5.0 no longer needs Xamarin. So Xamarin seems like now it's just kind of like baked into .NET itself, where I guess in previous versions, you needed Xamarin in order to be able to develop cross-platform through .NET. So Xamarin is no longer needed. I'm imagining it's probably baked right into the framework itself. And the .NET framework is still only going to run on Windows. So I think the .NET framework has its days numbered. So an experienced developer that's currently using .NET, they're probably going to be working with legacy. Choose a password for the keyring. So this keyring is actually going to be on your machine. So you can actually use the same password as your machine. So this is the same as the password vault in Windows, the password storage in Mac. Ubuntu also uses something similar. And go ahead and click on next on the upper right. And this is, yeah, go ahead, give them feedback. And that you can leave that off, go to next. And look at that, Visual Studio Code.
Whoa, there
it is. So you can click on that. We'll install Visual Studio Code, but then I'll show you how to fix your, this is your machine password. I'll show you how to increase your resolution. And go back up, it says install. Yep. Give that a second. Unable to install, conflict message, snap code, install, change in progress. Oh, okay, we have to wait till the change finishes. So go ahead and we'll wait on this one. Go ahead and close this window. And yeah, click on done, install now. Yeah, this is what it was trying to install. So give it a second to run. It might have you restart the machine. So we'll see right now.